investigation into defence and veteran suicide is now in session.
It's with a heavy heart that we acknowledge the Royal Commission has been made aware of more deaths by suicide of serving and ex-serving defence members since the last public hearing in Canberra. This ongoing tragedy underscores the vital work of this Royal Commission.
As the Royal Commission has travelled around the country, the sense of a crisis still unfolding before our eyes has been constantly reinforced.
It has recently been reported that 5,700 veterans, that is 5.3% of veterans around Australia, will be homeless this year.
The suicide crisis in our defence forces may often be presumed or be seen to be the end product of trauma suffered in war.
It may be physical injuries that impair the person and the trauma associated with this. I can no longer do what I could do.
But the shocking evidence to the Royal Commission highlights the fact that the forms of trauma are many, and they can stem from experiences defence personnel suffer from their very first days in service.
It may be trauma in connection with bullying and harassment. It may be trauma suffered in connection with sexual assault. It may be moral trauma occurring when a deep feeling and sense of betrayal is felt, with an ethical or moral dilemma that goes to one's core.
The Royal Commission has shed new light on the brutal raw numbers of suicides in the defence and veterans communities.
Commissioners, for many years now, veterans organisations have disputed the number of deaths by suicide announced by the Commonwealth. The current figure of 1,273 deaths by suicide is likely to be in underestimation. The age-adjusted rate of suicide for ex-serving females was 127%, or 2.27 times higher when compared with Australian females.
Do you think Australians understand that it isn't just about war-related trauma that we're talking about here?
There's a significant proportion of people who have had issues and have suicided who have not actually been to a war zone. What that tells us is that the problems may also be in the mealroom or in the office or wherever they work, in the camp they're in. And you're right, I don't think a lot of people in Australia recognise that. Everybody naturally would probably assume that those who have had mental health issues have been primarily because of being involved in a war zone. That's not the case.
Since November last year, former senior New South Wales police officer Nick Kaldas and his fellow commissioners have been hearing evidence from veterans, experts and bureaucrats. Today, they released an interim report which paints a devastating picture of harm, abuse and suicide among our serving military and veterans. The Royal Commissioners pull no punches. For example, they describe the actions of the Morrison government between 2019 and 2022 as, quote, a dereliction of the Australian government's duty to veterans. But they make clear that governments on both sides have failed to address problems that go back decades. And they castigate the defence establishment for blocking and hampering the Commission's work. Its first recommendations are for an urgent overhaul of the laws and bureaucracy that are supposed to assist defence personnel and veterans, and of the laws that govern the way the Commission itself works. Are you angry about what you've heard?
I don't think anger is the right word, but you would have to have a heart of stone to have heard the stories we've heard and listening to people who have talked about their lived experience and not feel an enormous amount of empathy and hopefully motivation to right the wrongs and to try and make sure that the failings of the system don't continue.
So we're talking about a really serious cultural issue in defence. There have been a lot of inquiries into this. The interim report documents a lot of what defence is doing, but it doesn't seem to be changing.
There are definitely cultural issues within defence. There has not been adequate follow-up and follow-through with the previous inquiries. By our count, it's around the 57 mark, previous inquiries. What we want to ensure, and one of the things we will be doing, although we're not ready yet, is recommend to the government of the day a mechanism, a framework, an entity that will succeed us so that there isn't a need for a 58, 59 and 60th inquiry.
The interim report reveals the backlog of compensation claims still pending at the Department of Veteran Affairs has been rapidly growing. The government released the report today as soon as it received it, in the interests of transparency, so is yet to consider its response, though Veterans Affairs Minister Matt Keogh recognises the urgency of clearing the backlog.
As a new government, we are delivering the 500 additional staff to the Department of Veterans Affairs so that we can get through that backlog as soon as possible.
The government's put 500 extra staff in place already. Is your feeling that that's enough, or that there may have to be more done in terms of the extra staffing?
I'm happy that the government have taken steps already and appear to be continuing to look at what we're saying so that they can fix the problems. People waiting to get help who may wait for quite some months before someone gets to them. That's the problem.
Karen Bird, whose son Jesse took his own life, has been watching the hearings closely. She argues the veterans who go to make claims have the system stacked against them by design.
Jesse received nothing. If they're going to harmonise the legislation, we actually need to look back and see why was it structured that way, and if indeed the Department of Veteran Affairs is, as I suggest, an insurance company, we need to actually acknowledge that, and we actually need to make Defence accountable for some of that, the damage they do. The department is there to minimise government exposure to the liabilities inside that Defence Service contract.
That may be one of the problems, but there are other problems. And I don't think it was intentional, but the process now to claim it's simply too complex, too protracted, too difficult, and something will need to be done to untangle that and start again.
Alarmingly, the report also notes that not only has there been a surge in compensation claims to Veterans Affairs, but an ever-growing number of reports of unacceptable behaviour in the services in the past decade. For example, in the Air Force, the number of reports grew from 22 in 2011 to 361 in 2021, despite the issue of defence culture allegedly being dealt with throughout this period. Can I ask you, what would you say to your kids if they wanted to join the Defence Forces now, based on what you've heard?
I don't think I'd oppose my kids joining the military, but I would be urging caution, and I'd be giving them a hell of a lot of advice.
And what would that advice be?
To be careful how they interact with people, to be brave and report things that may have run off the rails, not to let them slide. And to have courage to come forward and speak up when things are not right, whether it's something that affects them or others around them.